Hey everybody, welcome again. This is Joseph S. Samaniego, the author of the Carolingian Age fantasy book series, and I am back with another reaction video. This one is how to build the perfect castle. Now, if you've read any of my books, you know castles play a big part of it. Castle life is a big part of a lot of my books. I don't know if I said read my videos or read my books, but if whatever. So again, castles are a big part of medieval history, and even going further back, their fortifications. We've talked about them before. I've done videos on them before, but here we're going to look at someone else's take and kind of react to this very cool video. At least it looks cool, very cool. I haven't actually seen it, from Epic History. And this is how to build a perfect castle.
In Europe's Middle Ages, castles dominated not just warfare, but society itself. Strongholds are as old as war, but the medieval castle was unique. A refuge and a projection of military force, a lordly residence and symbol of power, a centre of justice and government. Today, castle ruins are found from the Atlantic coast to the hills of Syria, dramatic and poignant reminders of a lost feudal world.
Yeah, so the castles are very symbolic for not only, you know, their imposing structure and warfare, but it was also almost a status symbol, and especially as the years went on. First, they were very functional. It was almost minimalistic with their function. However, they got more elaborate, and it became more of a status symbol as opposed to a actual fortification. But when castles were first built and first used, it was a defensive fortification used for basically for the well-being of that region. And if you didn't take the castle, you couldn't take the region. So
there was no single blueprint for the castle. Every one was unique. But by analysing key trends over 4 centuries, Epic History TV is proud to present its guide to building the perfect castle.
That was a pretty cool castle right there. Looked very Norman style keep, and the outer wall, the baileys were pretty well fortified, so that would be a tough one to take.
The medieval castle was the product of a feudal world. A world we'll explore with help from our video sponsor, Crusader Kings 3. Using the in-game map, we can zoom in on 9th century France, the birthplace of feudalism. This was a time when royal authority was in crisis, as Frankish kings, the heirs of Charlemagne, struggled to control unruly nobles and fight off Viking armies. Increasingly, the king would grant a piece of land, known as a fief, and the promise of protection to a lord. The lord became the king's vassal, swearing an oath of loyalty or fealty, and providing military service when required. These feudal lords began to build fortified bases across the land, in which to live and from which to impose their authority on their new domains. These were the first medieval castles. If you'd like to experience the challenge of feudal lordship for yourself, we can recommend Crusader Kings 3, a new game from Paradox and our video sponsor. It's set in a richly detailed medieval world in which your task is to guide your chosen dynasty to power, wealth, and glory. How you do this is entirely up to you. Rule with an iron fist and terrorize your vassals into obedience? Build alliances by marrying off relatives? Or rid yourself of a troublesome priest by having him murdered, ideally without getting caught? Every character in Crusader Kings 3 has a unique personality, moulded by nature and their own history. All have strengths and weaknesses that a wise ruler can exploit.
Very cool.
Each game spans centuries, allowing you to forge your own epic tale of dynastic triumph or disaster. Crusader Kings 3 is out now. Click the link in our video description to find out more.
So before we go on, we've talked about feudalism in another video. I did a quick explanation of it. The other aspect that with the history of feudalism is it really kind of did begin in the 800s, the 9th century, in the 800s, around the time of Charlemagne. But even before that, Charles Martel, Charlemagne's grandfather, to get money to hire soldiers and mercenaries, what he did was he actually confiscated lands from the church, and he divided that out amongst these soldiers that eventually did become knights, and gave this land to them and said, hey, if you fight with us against the incoming Muslim invaders, you'll get this land. And with it came a few promises. Now, there was a lot more that needed to happen after that to kind of get these warriors to settle down, in a sense. And that came in subsequent years. However, this is really one of the first times that we see land being used in exchange for military service to a particular lord, which is basically what feudalism was. And that's a very true point right there.
When building a new castle, the first and most important consideration is location.
And we hear it time and again, when it comes to real estate, location, location, location. The area I live in is very big in real estate right now. So because it's a prime location, there's a lot of areas around the country that people really like these areas because of various things. The shopping's great, or the views are great. You go talk about going into the mountains and having views, or in the beachside views. Those are like prime locations. In the Middle Ages, hilltops were prime locations. Why? Because number one, you could see people coming from far off, and number two, it was very hard for them to attack you.
And he's probably going to go into that.
A castle should dominate the landscape, with good views in all directions. So hills are ideal. Steep slopes and river bends can be used to limit approach routes, making the site easier to defend.
Yeah, so like the river and the kind of how the river bends around this particular hill, it's very similar to what you would consider to be like, a kind of a moat. It just adds another level of defense for you against incoming invaders.
And for building work, a local source of stone, wood and soil is essential, as transporting these materials over medieval roads is more expensive than the materials themselves. There must also be a secure local source of fresh water and food to sustain the castle's occupants. A reliable starter castle is the Motte and Bailey, popular with the Normans, who built hundreds across England and Wales during the Norman conquest. The Motte.
And we talked a little bit about this in the last video. We talked about it in other videos. The Motte and Bailey style castle is the quintessential Norman look prior to the stone, but also Anglo-Saxons also used them quite a bit. And this also kind of was reminiscent of the Viking style that used an earthen works circular around it. These sorts of castles were very defensible because they had the land help them allow to use it to the point of that they were able to develop into this what became a very strategic location.
Is a mound, either natural or built by hand, as seen here in the biotapestry. It's not just a pile of mud though. These coloured bands are thought to represent alternating layers of stone and clay, which will increase stability. Sometimes they even used stone or timber foundations. A typical motte is 8 meters high and up to 50 meters across. Its top can be defended by a simple wooden palisade and a tower, living quarters for the lord and his entourage, and last refuge in case of attack. An earth ditch and palisade should enclose the bailey to protect important buildings such as a hall, stables, kitchen, stores, and a forge.
Yeah, so within that bailey, within that outer wall, you're going to have your primary function things. You're not really going to have where people live, but you're going to have the primary function things, and your army or your garrison probably would live within that, more likely within that hall or one of the other one of the other buildings within that wall. But yeah, you're going to have your forge because you're going to need those weapons. You're going to need your horses shoed. You're going to need various things completed and things close for the Lord. So that's why you have the kitchen there and everything. But outside your bailey is where you're going to have your people live. And that's really, they would come in where it's more defensible.
Into the wall.
Timber palisades are vulnerable to fire and rot, so will ideally be replaced by an enclosing stone wall, known as a curtain wall, as soon as possible. This creates the enceinte, or main defensive enclosure. A curtain wall should have crenellations to protect soldiers of the garrison during an attack, as they shoot their bows or crossbows at the enemy. A concealed postern gate, or sally port, can be used during a siege to smuggle messages in and out of the castle, or to launch surprise attacks on the enemy. In parts of France, such as Anjou and Poitou, castle builders ignored the motte and bailey approach and constructed strong stone towers. In French, it's called a donjon, the origin of the word dungeon. In England, it's known as the keep. A keep offers better security and accommodation than a wooden tower. But if you try to build one on top of a motte, its weight will cause it to collapse.
Yeah, so the stone keeps were an advancement on the wooden keep that you saw from the Anglo-Saxons and even in some of the Frankish lands. But as he said, it is heavier. So that's when they started to develop the more of the shell keep, which was more circular. Most of the time it was circular, and what it had inside was it was empty. And it was really just an outer wall was stone. And the inside was made of wood. It's still defensible, not as great as maybe a traditional stone keep, but it was able to be placed on the existing motte where you didn't have to reinforce a motte. You got to remember that keeps like this, anytime you're working with stone, it was more expensive. It was harder to quarry the stone than it was to chop the wood. So it was more expensive, and it was more time consuming. So that you really kind of had to look at it economically as well. And of course, yeah, they would raise taxes to build castles and fortifications in the premise that, hey, we're doing this to protect everybody. But then you also had to think that, hey, but that lord over there's castle is cooler than mine, so I'm going to build a better one.
Some opt for a compromise, a shell keep, which keeps the motte and replaces its wooden palisade with a circular stone wall. But a truly imposing keep will have to be built from scratch on carefully prepared foundations. A typical early stone keep is rectangular, between 2 and 4 stories high, with walls up to 6 meters thick. Construction might take up to 10 years and cost a fortune, so large keeps are only built by monarchs and powerful nobles.
And this is a really good looking Norman style, what we consider Norman style keep. It was just it was either square or, like you said, rectangular. And a lot of that was built because it was easier to build than it would be to build a circular. We do see circular towers and keeps later on. But as far as this goes, this was the beginnings of it around the late 11th century. Very defensible and very, very easy to house more people in this comfortably. I use that term, loosely, depending on what your level of comfort is. But it was easier to house more of your garrison and servants here in this type of keep, along with special guests and your lord's family, than it would be in a wooden keep.
The biggest keeps have towers at each corner. Within, there might be a hall for meals and entertainment, private apartments, a chapel, and storerooms.
And at this time, chapels inside your keep for the Lord inside the home was very common. It was almost like a necessity that you had to. Whether you believed or not, you almost had to have a chapel in there. You can see castles today that are from the Middle Ages that have either been remodeled or the ruins are not quite so ruined that you can see where the chapel was, or you can see the frescoes or the paintings on the wall that indicated that was a chapel. So it was very common to have a chapel in your keep, and you would go and pray pretty much every morning.
A forebuilding creates an impressive and well-guarded entrance, which should be at first floor level, accessed by a wooden staircase, which can be removed in case of attack. If the keep has a cellar, this is an ideal space to store extra provisions, not for chaining up prisoners in the dungeons of popular imagination. Early keep.
Yeah, not all places had dungeons. Keeping prisoners was not as ideal as the movies and the games and the books kind of tell you. A lot of times you would keep them, and depending on if they were noble, you would keep them in somewhat of, not really a comfort, but you would keep them somewhat house arrest, and then ransom them, because you would want them to do that to you as well. So it really wouldn't necessarily be in the dungeons. Commoners would have less luxury provisions. Obviously, they would be kept in more prison-like conditions, but they also wouldn't be ransomed, or if they were, it would take a long time to ransom them. Most time, the punishments would go into what we would consider then to be more capital punishment.
Keeps are square or rectangular, but later come in many shapes and sizes. King Philippe Augustus of France was particularly fond of circular keeps. Perhaps the most eye-catching of all is Castel del Monte in southern Italy, built by Emperor Frederick II. Its elaborate polygonal structure reminds us that the perfect castle must be elegant as well as formidable.
Yeah, towers were really important. Circular towers meant there was
The curtain wall should be strengthened by flanking towers at regular intervals. These project forward from the wall, so archers can shoot at attacking enemies with enfilade fire, or put another way, attackers will come under fire from the wall ahead of them, as well as from towers to the right and left.
And what you wanted to do too, and this is why circular towers kind of did start becoming more popular, is you want to eliminate as many blind spots as you could. There is a certain point when, in this, you wouldn't really see it as much, but there is a certain point where if the attacker got to the walls here, they may not be as vulnerable to arrows as they would be with different types of towers. They'd be vulnerable to other elements of defense, such as rocks and oils, or more likely boiling water, but they may not be as vulnerable to arrows.
Square towers offer large amounts of extra space for living quarters and storage, but their corners are a weak point that can be targeted by enemy stone-throwing artillery, such as a trebuchet. So round towers may be a better option. The choice is.
The other aspect of round towers, and I'm sure he's going to talk about the way that the walls themselves are built, when you kind of have a slope wall, it helps deflect and disperse the impact of stones. So what they do, instead of just hitting directly on, especially as he said, the corners, what the round and slopes do would be, once it hits the impact, it deflects the impact out, but it also allows, it's kind of like on certain types of ships where you have the slope, and especially with oak, it would almost bounce off to a point or just
Fall off.
Is often one of taste, fashion, and/or cost. Square towers, round towers, and D-shaped towers were all common across Europe, and many castles feature a mix of types. In some places, it was possible to cut costs by reusing old Roman fortifications, as at Pevensey and Portchester on England's south coast.
Yeah, so in England they did use, and even in Spain they used it too. They used a lot of the Roman walls that were built and a lot of the structures that were already in place. Like I said, in Spain it was pretty common to do that as well, and even in Rome they did that. It was just, they were there, and even if they didn't use the walls or the buildings themselves as they were, they would take the stones and reuse the stones, and that saved a lot of cost.
Here, the Normans simply built a stone keep within the walls of an old Roman shore fort, saving time, labour, and money. Loopholes, or arrow slits, are important additions for any tower or wall section. The earliest versions are simple vertical slits, but from the 14th century, more decorative cross shapes are common. In the event of a siege, wooden hoardings, sometimes called RRATTICE work, can be built out over the walls to allow the garrison to rain boiling water and rocks onto the attacking enemy.
It also made it harder to get up into the wall. So if you see the ladders, you could scale that wall and climb over it on your ladder. However, if you have this basically whole outcropping of a building stopping you, now you have to manage to climb over that, which it would be extremely very difficult. So it was another just way of defense. Plus, it added extra footing for your own soldiers, and then it added a way to for your soldiers to attack the attackers. Gates are getting a lot more.
The obvious focus for an attack is the castle's main gate, so its defences, known as the gatehouse, must be especially strong. The ideal solution is to add towers on each side of the gateway, to add an outer and inner gate, and at least one, if not several, portcullises. These metal lattice gates can be dropped vertically to trap attackers in a kill zone. The garrison can then use murder holes in the ceiling and walls to finish off the intruders. The main gate can be further protected by a drawbridge over the outer moat or ditch, which can be raised by chains as an enemy approaches.
And you see the theme here is that a lot of these structures that they have for entrances, such as the stairs going up into the keep, you can see this bridge next to the drawbridge itself. A lot of these are wooden, and that allowed the defenders to burn them and get rid of them to make it even harder for the attackers to reach them. So it was just another aspect of, this is how we're going to defend ourselves. Once we win, once we fight these guys off, we can rebuild it really quick. It's not a problem. But for them to come over here and try to attack us, they won't be able to use it.
Through the Middle Ages, gatehouses became increasingly powerful, with multiple drawbridges, gates, and portcullises. The approach covered by looming towers, and every wall and ceiling studded with loopholes and murder holes. Some of the most formidable gatehouses are found in the castles built by Edward I to subdue Wales in the late 13th century. Such imposing wall defences began to make a massive keep seem superfluous, so many of these castles were built without a keep at all.
Yeah, the first function of your keep really was to the defense. This is where people went to defend themselves. You know, if your gatehouse and your outer wall is to the point where people can't get in, it's impenetrable, you're kind of going to waste money in building this really huge keep. To a point. I mean, there's still a lot of reasons to have one, but, you know, economically, why spend the money there when you can spend the money on the outside and then be able to save it elsewhere?
Our castle is now an imposing fortress, able to withstand a siege of several months, if properly provisioned. But to be considered truly epic, a castle should have a second curtain wall, enclosing an outer bailey, with its own towers and gatehouse. Gatehouses.
Just think about how expensive this is getting right now.
I mean, this is going to be in the wealthy zone. This is a monarch's, possibly a duke maybe, but mostly a monarch's wealth at this point, because you're talking about a lot of stone, a lot of time, and a lot of labor.
These should be positioned at angles to the approach route, so any attacker has to twist and turn, rather than make a direct rush at the gate. Towers and walls should now feature stone machicolations for dropping rocks on the enemy.
And that's what I was talking about earlier when I said how if they got to the wall, they shouldn't, yeah, they may be less vulnerable from arrow fire, but they would be vulnerable from other sorts of defense measures, such as the rocks or even boiling water.
Far more sophisticated than temporary wooden hoardings. The new outer bailey, or ward, allows more buildings to be brought within the castle's defences, not forgetting that a medieval castle is as much a residence as fortification. Perhaps a new, grander hall for entertaining your household and important guests, kitchen gardens, and extra living quarters. The outer ditch or moat can be flooded with water to create an extra layer of defence. A water moat also has decorative value and can be a source of fresh fish. A final flourish,
Yeah, as long as you're not emptying your bathrooms into that moat. That was kind of common too, and it just added insult to injury as well. When you had an attacker and they get trapped in the moat, now they have a lingering infection going home with them, or things like that they would use. There are stories of how people would use tainted water to quell their enemies, either in their camps. They would sneak into their camps and taint their water, which would provide dysentery. They would kind of rub salt or feces or just blood, animal blood, onto their weapons. And so when they cut you, or when it would enter your blood and into your bloodstream, it would hurt, but it would also cause infection. It would hurt more from the salt, but it would also cause infection. So there's a lot of that as well.
Barbican, an outlying fortification that adds yet another layer of defence to the main entrance. This is now a fine and formidable example of a concentric castle. Its design will force any attacker to overcome successive layers of strong defence to reach the final refuge, the keep. If properly garrisoned and supplied, a castle like this was virtually impregnable until the age of gunpowder.
And
What you're seeing too is that if you're up
on these top towers,
where some of the garrison would be stationed just to watch over things, you're going to see people coming from long ways off, where you're going to give people time, and you're going to give time for those provisions to get in if they're not already stored. You're going to give people time to get into the castle, and then you're going to conscript a lot of the men and the older boys to help you defend it. So it really was a it really was just a very important aspect of medieval life to have a good castle, because it allowed you not only to defend yourself, to defend your town, but it gave you a place to also store your goods and store your people in times of need. I didn't mean to say store your people, house your people.
As we have seen, there was no single blueprint for the medieval castle. Each was built to take advantage of the landscape, to incorporate.
No, I mean, look at that. That is it's on a rocky, I mean, you're not getting people up that very easily. Just climbing that up. Climbing up to that first wall would be just difficult. Even for, I mean, you would have to have a lot of mountain climbing skills, in my opinion. As steep as that is and as treacherous as that looks, because that looks like a lot of loose rock, especially right around this area. That is pretty tough looking. And then just the straight up wall. Yeah, that would be a tough one.
The latest military thinking and reflect regional styles and personal taste. The most awe-inspiring examples from the castle's golden age include KRAK de Chevalier, the supposedly impregnable Crusader fortress of the Knights Hospitaller. Dover Castle, known as the Key to England. And MALBORK Castle, the gigantic brick-built headquarters of the Teutonic Knights.
If I'm not mistaken, that is actually the biggest brick, for a long time, it was the biggest brick building in the world. But I think, if I'm not, I could be wrong with that, but I think it's also still considered the biggest brick castle that exists. Brick, not just stone or, but brick.
By the 15th century, the castle's role was in steep decline, in part due to the rise of gunpowder weapons, such as cannon, but more fundamentally because the feudal world that gave rise to the castle had fallen away, to be replaced by professionalized armies and centralized royal authority.
Yeah, so when the mercenaries really started taking off, and the mercenaries have been around for centuries at this point even. I mean, we know about mercenaries from even the antiquity, but at this point mercenaries are really coming into play because they're professionally trained soldiers. Before this, when a duke or count wanted to defend his land or go to war, he would conscript a lot of the people who lived on his land, which there were laws in place that said they had to have military training when they weren't working, and that's good and all. But that wasn't as good as somebody who, this is my job. My job is to be a warrior. So that's what I get my gold for. And the reason I have a lot of gold is because I'm good at what I do. That kind of played into itself for what you needed. So when you get those, the whole idea of having a landed force of your tenants starts to kind of dwindle away. The gunpowder aspect of it, yeah, we also see that, when the Ottomans broke down the walls of Constantinople, that really ended a big era for not only castles, but fortifications in general. And we see the style of fortifications really change. And in fact, there's a scene in Kingdom of Heaven, which is not really great for the timeline. It's a deleted scene, actually. So if you see the director's cut, you'll see it where Balian, Orlando Bloom's character, is talking to King Baldwin about fortifications, and they start talking about a star fortress, a star-shaped fortress. And that did not really come into play for a couple hundred years after when that movie was taking place. But that's really when you start seeing the true artillery forts that can combat against cannon fire. And that's part of the evolution of fortifications, but there is no castle involved in that. It's just fortifications.
As the age of powerful feudal lords ended, so too did the age of the castle. Most would ultimately slide into ruin, their military role replaced by artillery forts, their residential role taken over by palaces and stately homes, as the age of the castle gave way to the age of the chateau.
And you can see in some of the chateaus, you can still see
Some of the castle elements,
such as crenellations, but they're not used to that extent at this point anymore. Your guards are different. Your castle guards are posted more at the gates, and you still might have a gatehouse like you would with the outer wards or the bailies, but they're different functions now, and your artillery forts are placed in other strategic locations, so now you don't have a wall surrounding your main location. In fact, your palace is probably, not even close to your town as it used to be with the keeps.
Thanks again to our video sponsor, Crusader Kings 3. Use the link in the video description to check out this new medieval strategy game of unrivaled depth and sophistication.
Okay, so I guess you're just going to talk about the game now, which is a really cool game. Check it out. I actually got a couple gameplay videos on my channel where I'm playing Crusader Kings 3. In fact, I'm playing as Castile in one of them, if I'm not mistaken. And that is part of the area that did have a couple major castles similar to what they were showing here. So, again, this has been kind of fun for me. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Me talking just a little bit of my commentary on some of the castles. There's a lot that goes in castles. I've done videos on castles before, just on the castles in general, and kind of how they also relate to fantasy, this fantasy genre and fantasy culture. Because we do see, especially Motte and Bailey style castles, we do see that a lot in the fantasy genre. We see castles a lot in really all sorts of castles in the fantasy genre. There's a lot of cool Norman style castles in Game of Thrones, and there are some that you can tell that they were made just for the sake of being cool looking as opposed to their functionality. Whereas we see here, we see more functional and then evolve later on to more stately manners and looks as opposed to being a defensive fortification. But their defensive fortification and the histories of that cannot be downplayed. They were the forts of their day, and really they could make or break an army. So again, I hope you've enjoyed this. I'm looking forward to doing more. There's a couple others that I really want to kind of react to, but until then, be sure to check out my books. You can find them on Amazon and a couple other retailers. Scoring just came out, and until next time, this has been Joseph S. Samiego, and I'm the author of the Carolingian Age series. So till we see each other again.